You've been told your entire life that the pursuit of happiness was written for you, that it's your birthright. But what if that phrase was never about your joy, your fulfillment, or your personal freedom? In 1776, it was a coded stand-in for something far more specific: property, stability, and a rigid class order. It was a political term, not a psychological one. So if this foundational promise never actually meant a universal right to joy, why does it sound like the ultimate promise of freedom? It gets more complicated. The intellectual blueprint came from John Locke's triad: life, liberty, and property. But Thomas Jefferson didn't invent the swap himself. He borrowed the phrase pursuit of happiness from the Virginia Declaration of Rights, written by George Mason just weeks earlier. Mason had already blended Locke's ideas with broader Enlightenment philosophy. For the landed elites who signed the Declaration, property and this idea of happiness were one and the same. You couldn't have one without the other. But this immediately raises a terrifying question. Who exactly counted as a property owner in 1776? And what did that definition mean for the vast majority of people who were legally considered property themselves? And that's the true genius and the true tragedy of the phrase. Its beauty is in its vagueness. It sounds like a universal gift, a promise extended to everyone. But in reality, that language was a rhetorical shield. It reflected the lofty ideals of the era, but in practice fiercely guarded the exclusion of women, indentured servants, native peoples, and the enslaved. The rhetoric invited everyone in, while the law locked most of them out. And the deepest, most horrifying contradiction sat right there in plain sight: a nation founded on liberty, but built from the ground up on slavery. So, the pursuit of happiness was the catchy slogan of 1796. It sounded fresh, it sounded noble. It was the perfect headline for a revolution. But its function was the same as any good slogan: inspiring enough to stick in your memory and deliberately vague enough to avoid serious scrutiny. It was marketing. So what happens? What do we finally see when we dare to read beyond the headline? How could the man who so elegantly penned the words, "All men are created equal," live his entire life surrounded by the brutal reality of slavery? Thomas Jefferson's Monticello stands as the ultimate monument to this breathtaking paradox. His leisure to read, to write, to philosophize about liberty, it was all funded, every second of it, by the forced labor of hundreds of enslaved people. His pursuit of happiness was built on their pursuit of survival. So if happiness for the founders really meant maintaining a stable social order, what kind of order was so precious that it required defending with such a profound contradiction? Because that's the key. In the 18th century, happiness didn't mean inner joy. It drew from the concept of eudaimonia, a sense of public and private well-being tied to virtue and the common good. But in practice, this philosophy was narrowly applied, meaning a specific controlled harmony among the propertied class. The founders weren't psychiatrists dreaming of your personal fulfillment. They were architects, designing a stable society where their own power, wealth, and privileges could endure. The phrase was a bulwark against chaos, but if the pursuit of happiness was originally a polite code for this controlled social order, how on earth did it get rebranded into America's most personal, most cherished individual dream? We often try to soften this blow with a convenient myth, that they were men of their time, that they just didn't know better. But that's too easy. They knew. The coexistence of liberty for some and brutal slavery for others was not an accidental oversight. It was a deliberate, calculated bargain. A compromise made to preserve the very social order their pursuit of happiness was designed to protect. They chose this. They signed their names to it. So if the contradiction was baked in from the very start, how did the meaning of this phrase undergo such a radical, transformative evolution over the next 2 centuries? Look no further than Jefferson's own home. Monticello wasn't just a residence, it was a stage set, a meticulously designed piece of theater. The polished front, the elegant gardens, the refined architecture, it presented a picture of enlightened civilization. But the enslaved labor that made it all possible was kept deliberately hidden from view, tucked away behind walls and shuttered in underground passageways. Happiness, for one man, in this framework, required the absolute invisibility of others. It was a performance. And that makes you wonder, if the American pursuit of happiness was founded on a requirement to hide an uncomfortable reality, what else has this nation been keeping backstage ever since? Over the centuries, the very word happiness slowly drifted away from its 18th century anchor, pulled by currents of revolution, industry, and a new sense of self. It shifted from meaning collective virtue and social order towards something intensely personal: individual freedom, pleasure, self-expression. The definition was never fixed in stone. It was always a contested idea, a cultural battleground. And this ambiguity, this vagueness that served the founders so well, was about to be seized by an even more powerful force. Because if happiness once meant maintaining a stable social order, capitalism would brilliantly recast it as the freedom to consume. Products, advertising, and the entire engine of the American dream turned the philosophical pursuit into a literal buying spree. That original vagueness became a marketer's ultimate weapon. You could project any desire onto it. But this creates a terrifying paradox. What happens when your most sacred freedom, your right to pursue happiness, is systematically reduced to the choices you make in a shopping aisle? Work hard, buy more, be happy. It sounds so simple, so universally accessible. But this reinvented dream performed an incredible sleight of hand. It erased the phrase's elitist property-owning origins while simultaneously preserving its core link between joy and ownership. It became a story for mass belief, not a statement of truth. A powerful, seductive myth. But myths can be challenged. And that raises a revolutionary question. If the meaning of happiness was completely rewritten once, could we possibly rewrite it again? The pursuit of happiness has always functioned like the perfect brand slogan for America. Incredibly inspiring, yet deliberately empty. Its true power was in its vagueness. It meant political order to Jefferson, it meant consumerism to advertisers, and it meant destiny to school children reciting the pledge. It meant whatever anyone needed it to mean. But all slogans eventually face a moment of reckoning. What happens when the nation finally stops to read the fine print? Jefferson's version of happiness was deeply tied to civic virtue, to duty, to the collective good of the Republic. Today, we often treat happiness as something closer to a dopamine hit, a quick scroll, a new notification, a fleeting moment of pleasure. These are two completely different worlds, yet they're both using the exact same phrase. If the meaning can swing this wildly from collective duty to individual gratification, what, if anything, is actually left of the original promise? Remember standing in a classroom, hand over your heart, reciting those words from the Declaration? It felt like a sacred promise, written just for you. The phrase, pursuit of happiness, glowed with pure, untarnished possibility. The idea that joy, whatever that meant to you, was your undeniable birthright. No questions asked, it was a gift. But that feeling, that innocence, depends entirely on the history you weren't told. And once you know it, that glow changes forever. Reading the Declaration of Independence as an adult is like discovering an old leather-bound diary. At first, the words feel personal, profound, almost magical. You see the elegant script and you feel a connection across time. But then you start to read between the lines. You realize the entries weren't written for you, they were written for a very specific, exclusive group. The beauty of the language begins to feel like a carefully constructed facade, hiding a much darker, more complicated intent. So what do you do? What do you do with a beautiful promise once you know in your bones that it was never truly yours to claim? Think of it like this. Jefferson's version of happiness was a symphony, a complex layered composition where every instrument had a fixed part to play to create a single harmonious whole for the system. Today, our idea of happiness is a personalized playlist, a collection of curated on-demand tracks that change with our mood, our algorithms, our individual desires. Both can sound beautiful in the moment, but they are fundamentally different experiences. One is about the collective, the other is about the self. And in that seismic shift from the symphony to the playlist lies the real, unresolved conflict at the heart of the American experiment. The tension between collective order and personal desire. As kids, freedom and happiness looked like recess. It was running, laughing, playing with no rules, no boundaries, just pure, unfiltered joy. That childlike view feels so pure, so simple, but it's a fantasy. The freedom in the Declaration was never about playgrounds. It was always, from the very first draft, about property lines. It was about deeds and titles and fences. So the question we're left with as adults, once that childhood illusion finally fades, is how do we grow up? How do we reckon with a founding ideal that is both profoundly inspiring and deeply flawed? Every inspiring slogan, every grand promise, has its fine print. For Jefferson and the founders, the pursuit of happiness was precisely that. A legal guarantee for a privileged few, not a universal dream for the many. The exclusions weren't an oversight. They were the entire point, baked into the foundation. But here's the terrifying part. Those exclusions, that fine print, it didn't just vanish in 1796. It echoes through the centuries. So why are we still taught this phrase in school as if it's a universal timeless truth? Because repetition is the ultimate hiding place for a difficult truth. Our civic culture presents it as an eternal ideal, turning a deliberate omission into a patriotic ritual. We recite the words to feel included without ever questioning who was originally left out. But rituals can be broken. What happens to a nation's identity when that centuries-old omission is finally fully exposed to the light? The pursuit of happiness has never stood still. It's a moving target. It has constantly shifted meanings, from property to civic virtue to consumer pleasure, each generation redefining it to suit the powerful. It's not a fixed promise carved in stone. It's a mirror reflecting who holds control in a given era. So if the very definition of happiness keeps changing to maintain that control, what, in the end, are we actually pursuing? Maybe, just maybe, the phrase was never about joy at all. From Jefferson's defense of a propertied class to capitalism's endless parade of products, happiness has consistently functioned as a tool, a brilliant, versatile mechanism to govern behavior, inspire loyalty, and sell things. It's a lever of power. And that leaves us with one haunting, deeply personal question. If this promise was never originally meant for you, how on earth do you claim it back? The real ghost haunting the Declaration of Independence isn't Thomas Jefferson, it's John Locke. Locke's original term, property, was never truly exercised. It just put on a disguise and called itself happiness. And no matter how much the meaning seems to shift toward freedom, toward fulfillment, it always, inevitably, circles back to the same core principles: ownership, wealth, and control. Which means the beautiful, inspiring promise of happiness has always fundamentally been about power, not people. So if this promise was never meant for you, what do you do with that knowledge? Do you discard it? Do you get cynical? Or does recognizing the fine print not erase the phrase's power, but instead hand that power to us? It forces us to ask the most urgent question of all: who gets to define happiness now? Maybe the only pursuit truly worth having is the collective courage to rewrite the meaning ourselves. If this exploration changed how you see that famous phrase, if it made you question the fine print of freedom itself, then do us a favor. Subscribe for more deep dives into the history they didn't teach us. And I want to hear from you. If you could rewrite the definition of the pursuit of happiness for our time, what would it include? Let's start that conversation in the comments. And if you're ready to question another famous phrase that's been twisted by history, watch our previous video on how the ends justify the means became a misquote that built empires and ruined lives.